The moment those words left my mouth, I felt the air in the room shift, and I knew there was no taking it back. It was the kind of careless thing you say without thinking, the kind of joke that's funny for exactly 1 second before it isn't. But some jokes don't just disappear into the noise of a Friday night. Some of them rearrange the rest of your life. I'm Jason Marlowe, and 11 years ago, in a quiet suburb just outside Hamilton, Ontario, Sid said something to my best friend's mother that I never planned to mean. I was 23 then, working mornings at a hardware store on Upper James Street and taking night classes at Mohawk College, trying to figure out if I wanted to be an electrician or something else entirely. My best friend Aaron Whitcomb had been around since we were 12 years old, since the days of street hockey and skipping gym class to play video games in his basement. We'd grown up 2 streets apart, and somewhere along the way his house had become as familiar to me as my own. Aaron lived with his mother, Renata Whitcomb, in a narrow 2-story house with a covered porch and a maple tree out front that turned the whole yard gold every October. His parents had split when he was 11, and his dad had moved out west not long after, the way some fathers do when staying feels harder than leaving. So it had been Renata and Aaron for over a decade, the two of them figuring it out together. Renata wasn't loud. She wasn't the kind of person who demanded attention, but she had this way of walking into a room that made you notice anyway. Steady, unhurried, like she'd already decided who she was and didn't need anyone else's opinion on it. She worked as a dental hygienist at a clinic downtown, and she'd raised Aaron mostly on her own, picking up extra shifts when money got tight, never once complaining about it in front of us. To me, she had always just been Aaron's mom, the woman who kept extra Gatorade in the fridge for us after hockey practice, the one who'd yell up the stairs that the pizza was getting cold. That's all I ever let myself see her. As at least that's what I told myself. It was a Thursday night in late September, unseasonably warm for that time of year, the kind of evening where you leave the windows open and let the smell of cut grass drift in. Aaron and I were sprawled on his living room couch, a hockey game playing low on the TV, a half-eaten box of pizza going cold on the coffee table between us. Nothing important was happening. Nothing was supposed to happen. Renata got home around 8, still in her scrubs from the clinic, her keys jingling as she set them down on the side table by the door. She looked tired in that specific way people look after a long shift, not falling apart, just worn and smooth at the edges. She walked past us toward the kitchen, and Aaron, without really thinking about it, made some offhand comment about how she should change out of her work clothes already. And then, without pausing, without filtering a single thought before it left my mouth, I laughed and said it. I told him his mom was better looking than half the girls I'd dated in the last 5 years. The room went quiet in a way that felt physical. Aaron turned and stared at me like I'd just said something about his sister, not his mother. My stomach dropped the second the words were out, and I tried to laugh it off, tried to make it sound like the dumb, throwaway joke I'd intended it to be. But then Renata stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at me, and her expression wasn't what I expected. It wasn't offended. It wasn't embarrassed. It was something closer to curious, like she was turning the sentence over in her head, examining it from a few different angles. Then she asked if I'd like to take her out sometime. For a second, I thought she was joking. Aaron laughed nervously, clearly assuming the same thing. But Renata didn't laugh. She just looked at me steadily and said she meant it. The silence that followed felt like it went on for an entire winter. I could feel Aaron's eyes on me, waiting for me to say something that would put the world back the way it was supposed to be. But nothing about that moment felt like it was going back to normal. I mumbled something about how I'd only been joking, that I hadn't meant anything serious by it. Renata gave a small smile, shrugged one shoulder, and said that sometimes the jokes people make are the truest things they say all week. Then she walked down the hallway to her room, leaving Aaron and me sitting there in a silence so heavy it had its own weight. Aaron barely said 2 words to me the rest of that night. I drove home not long after, and I didn't blame him one bit. What I didn't expect was that I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not about the joke itself, but about the way she'd looked at me when she asked. At first, it was just confusion, replaying the moment over and over, trying to make sense of it. Then it became something closer to curiosity. And eventually, weeks later, something I didn't want to put a name to yet. Renata wasn't just my best friend's mother. She was a woman who had built an entire life out of showing up, for her job, for her son, for a house that needed a new roof and a car that needed new brakes, all on one income. She'd raised a kid alone in a city that wasn't cheap, in a country where the cost of just about everything seemed to climb every year, and she'd never once let it show on the surface. I started seeing all of that, like it had been there the whole time, and I'd just never bothered to look. Over the next month, I found reasons to come around less. Partly guilt, partly because I genuinely didn't know how to act in that house anymore. But one Saturday afternoon, I drove back to pick up a wrench set I'd left behind after helping Aaron with his car, and Renata was outside on the porch, watering a row of potted mums she'd lined up along the railing. We ended up talking, just small things at first: work, the cost of groceries lately, whether the Leafs had any chance this season. But the conversation kept drifting somewhere deeper, the way conversations do when neither person is in a hurry to leave. She told me how quiet the house got once Aaron started spending more time with his girlfriend, how she'd spent so many years focused entirely on raising him that she'd forgotten what it felt like to think about her own life. She told me about a pottery class she'd signed up for years ago and never finished, about a version of herself she'd put on pause indefinitely. I listened in a way I hadn't really listened to anyone in a long time. For the first time, I wasn't seeing Aaron's mother standing in front of me. I was seeing Renata. Those conversations kept happening over the following month, sometimes 5 minutes on the porch, sometimes an hour at her kitchen table, with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between us. We never brought up the joke directly, but it sat underneath everything we said, quiet and unavoidable. Then one evening, as the light was fading and the porch lamp buzzed on automatically, she told me that life doesn't really follow the neat rules people expect it to. She said sometimes people find each other at exactly the wrong moment, and the only real mistake is pretending you don't feel what you feel. She said if I'd meant even a fraction of what I'd joked about that night, I owed it to myself to be honest. Then she went back inside, and I sat in my car in front of her house for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about Aaron, about the years of friendship, about the kind of line you don't cross, with someone who's been like a brother to you since you were 12. But I also kept thinking about the way Renata had looked at me on that porch, calm, unhurried, like she already knew something I was still working to admit to myself. A week later, I asked Aaron if we could talk. It might be the hardest conversation I've ever had with another human being. I told him something had shifted in me, that I respected him more than almost anyone in my life, that our friendship mattered more to me than I could put into words. And then I told him the part that scared me, that I thought I had feelings for his mom. Aaron reacted exactly the way you'd expect. He went quiet, then angry, then he told me to get out of his apartment. For months after that, he wouldn't return my calls or texts. We'd been inseparable since middle school, and suddenly it was like none of that had ever happened. It was the lowest point I'd hit in years. I questioned everything, my judgment, my intentions, whether some boundaries exist for a reason, and I'd just trampled over one without thinking twice. During that stretch, Renata and I barely spoke either. She told me later she didn't want to be the reason Aaron and I lost each other completely. So she kept her distance too, even though it clearly cost her something to do it. But something started shifting on Aaron's end that I didn't find out about until much later. He told me, eventually, that he'd started noticing things about his mom he'd never paid attention to before. How she came home to an empty house every night. How she'd stopped mentioning her own plans because there was no one to share them with. How much of her life she'd quietly handed over to raising him without ever once asking for credit. Almost 7 months after that conversation in his apartment, Aaron called me. His voice was different, steadier, less raw. He told me something I still think about all the time. He said if I ever hurt his mother, he'd never forgive me for it. But if I actually cared about her, the way it seemed like I did, then maybe he needed to stop pretending the world only worked one way. A year after the night of that joke, Renata and I went on our first real date. Nothing extravagant. Dinner at a small Italian place near Lock Street in Hamilton. The kind of spot with mismatched chairs and a waiter who'd worked there for 15 years. We talked for 3 hours about everything from our childhoods to the strange, sideways way life sometimes moves you toward exactly where you're supposed to be. It felt less like the beginning of something new and more like something that had been quietly building for a long time, finally given permission to exist. These days, 11 years on, Aaron and I are closer than we've probably ever been. It wasn't a straight line getting here. There were arguments, a few painfully awkward Thanksgivings, stretches where all 3 of us were still figuring out how to exist in the same room without flinching. but time has a way of sanding down even the sharpest edges if you let it. Aaron eventually told me he'd come to understand that love doesn't really care about the timeline you had planned for your own life. It shows up in strange places, in the middle of ordinary evenings, sometimes right after the dumbest joke a person's ever made. Renata and I got married 4 years ago in her backyard, under that same maple tree that used to drop its leaves on us every October when we were kids. Aaron stood beside me the whole time, and every so often, when the three of us are sitting around the kitchen table, laughing about something that happened years ago, Aaron brings it up. The night I said the stupidest thing I've ever said out loud, the night that, somehow, turned into the start of everything that mattered,